Today we're going to be looking at the overall structure of Entity Framework in .NET applications. In front of me I have a pretty basic application that we have built. As you can see in your Solution Explorer, which is going to be on your right side of your screen, it can be relatively intimidating. Right now there's about 10 things here, and as I drop these down, a lot of stuff will pop up. So let's just open the application and not get too bothered by what we're looking at. So what I want to focus on in this tutorial is how we can work with some of the stuff that we have inside of our application. So inside of our admin panel, we see this option for bank account types. So when we open this, we just have this basic table that just has a name and a description, and we can create bank account types here. Let's just say test. And so what this does inside of our application is that clients now will have the option to use this bank account type that we've just made as a type when they create bank account information. So now I have this option here for test. So we're going to go over how that's even done. So stepping out of the application now, we'll go back into the Solution Explorer. So we're going to start at the very top and then we'll kind of work our way to the bottom. So the first thing that we would want to look at is our domain files. So if we go into our core section, we'll see domains, which is right here. Then we can go to bank account types, which will be right here. So here is the class file that builds bank account types. As you can see, we have the name and the description, and then the isActive Boolean value. Because we don't usually delete things completely, it's always just set as active or inactive. As you can see, this bank account type class is audited, which means that when we get into the actual database, this will automatically kind of add in who created it, who updated it. Very basic auditing features so we don't have to write any of that stuff in. So this is the class, the domain class. Moving out from that file, we would move next into the application layer where we would have our DTO and service options. So the DTO is going to be right here. It's going to look pretty much identical to your class. The purpose of the DTO is to help us transfer the data faster and more reliably. DTOs aren't necessarily directly attached to the database. This does have an auto mapper on it, so we don't have to create mapping files in this case. So this will automatically map the data from the DTO into the database when we do saves. Now, the service layer, which is also going to be inside of your application, is kind of broken up into two parts. You have your interface for the service and the actual service. So in the interface, really all it is just all of our function calls and then descriptions of what those functions do. So in the case of bank account types, we have a function that can get all of the table data, can get all of the functions or all of the bank types. We can get a bank account type by ID, and we can also change its status. So we go into the service layer, we'll see a section for properties and constructors. This just allows us to build the automapper, which will in turn give us the options that we need as far as the repository that we need to access when we're actually doing saving to the database. And that kind of stuff can get a little bit complicated, but we'll kind of not overcomplicate it in this case. Just know that when you're building these constructors, you're basically building your connection to the database, and that's going to be referred to as your repository. So here are all the actual implementations of these functions. For example, here's the table data. So in the case of the table, we're getting a bunch of bank account type DTOs, which in its structure is basically identical to the domain itself. and this is going to be in a list. So we're going to call to our repository, get all where they're active. So we're just getting all of the stuff that hasn't been soft deleted from the database, and then mapping that into a DTO so that we can send it to the user to see in the front end. So let's look at how that would work. So something that we can do from here is check these references. And one place that this is being referenced is a controller function, which would be the next step down. So in the controller function, we have this request to get table data, which essentially just calls to the service layer to get that data and then returns it to the front end where it's being called from. So one thing with the controller function is that you want to minimize how much is being done in the controller, which is why you're only seeing two things here. We're simply getting the data and returning it. There's not much else to it. Some controller functions can get more complicated, but in the case of just getting table data, it's pretty simple. So from the controller, we would move out into the actual view. So if we go into views now, bank account types, we have the index page. So this is the actual HTML page that opens when we click on that bank accounts type. And HTML can be kind of messy looking and confusing if you're new to programming, but as you kind of look at this, you'll notice that everything is just sort of sectioned off into groups or divs. So in this case, we have the section for our header, which can be broken up into multiple places, and right here we just have the title, bank account types. So as we scroll down, we'll notice right here is where we're declaring that table, and then the various columns in that table. So you're kind of looking at this, I'm assuming, and noticing that there's not really anything referencing that controller function. And that's because that isn't actually done here. This is what's showing the user what's displayed to the screen. But right here is our scripts, which actually run JavaScript. So as we can see right here, our referencing to the script is at bank accounts type index.js. So if we go find that file, so here is the JavaScript file. It's actually controlling what's going on that screen. So, and the first thing that we're seeing right here is the AJAX call for get table data. So now we know where that's coming from. So we started all the way at our service layer where we saw that function, when we saw who was calling it in the controller, and now we're seeing where in the front end that function is being called and why. So here we have that request, and once it's done, that data result will be mapped to the table. And right here, we can see all the things that are kind of building that table out. So if we scroll up here, we have multiple targets. And a lot of this is going to be stuff that's being initialized for the menu. So if I can pull up the application again, and go back to our bank account types. So this little widget right here with edit, deactivate, and delete, that is what's being programmed right here. This is how we determine what's going on. So if you kind of look at this, it does look like sort of a mess, but as you start to read it, you'll notice like this is saying drop down item, bank accounts type, and then it's for edit. And right here, we're sending the ID of that object. So what would happen if we hit edit, it would trigger that and it would load up an edit card and it sent the ID. So now we have the data for that. And the same thing would happen for these other two. You have the button that deactivates items. So in this case, it's switching the active, inactive, passing that row ID. So if we were to click that, it would deactivate the item. And the same thing with delete. And then down here, these are a little bit simpler calls for each of those columns. So the data for name, description, and the isActive, these will get populated into those sections on this table. So as it kind of maps that table out, it will see that field name, and map it to what was in the model or the DTO. And down here, as we're looking at the JavaScript, here's just some other functions that can be triggered. So notice how we were talking about that delete button here. Well, it just says delete, but how do we know what it does? As you scroll down here, this is the function that gets called. So right here is a declaration for that class. And so we can actually match that to this delete dash bank accounts type, which is what we determined that class was going to be. So on that click, it triggers this function, which will then, do what it does. In the case of this AJAX call, what we're doing is opening up a question to the user, are you sure you want to delete? So we can see what that looks like. If I were to click on this button for delete, that pop-up goes through. Now I'm not going to delete this in this case. I'm just going to go ahead and hit cancel, but we can see that is confirmed will trigger that AJAX call, which now goes back into that controller we were looking at earlier, and instead triggers this delete bank accounts type function. So if we go now into our controller, we can go to this post request section, and we can see that delete bank account types asynchronous call. And all asynchronous means is that it will happen essentially in the background. Once it's triggered, the user doesn't need to wait for it to finish because it's simply a delete function. So the user can gain back control of the system right away. But the server will actually continue to do what needs to be done to get that item deleted. So in this case, just like the table function that we were looking at earlier, we're calling to the service layer, delete async, and we're passing that ID that we passed in the front end. And so once that gets to the service layer function, it will delete the object from the table and it will reload. And we can see right here on done, we're referencing that table, AJAX, and then doing a reload. So that will allow us to reload the table. And in this case, I will delete the one that I made earlier to show how that works. Once I confirm it, table is deleted and refreshed, and now that item is gone. Technically, it's only inactive, so if I were to switch to inactives, I could see that it's there. So that is the basic structure from top to bottom of a lot of Entity Framework applications and kind of how things work from one place to another. And as we'll kind of recap, we started at our domain layer, which is basically the database itself, exactly what we were writing into the database, and that transitions into a DTO and service layer functions that control that DTO object. Then from there, we move into controller and then into our JavaScript. And that is how the structure works.